Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. After a very long, extended weekend, I feel it necessary now to kind of refresh my listeners' memory as to what we are speaking about here on Inquisition Update. Again, we're reading and discussing the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. We're talking about a period of time after the Protestant Reformation, when for the first time, Roman Catholic nations could look at the Protestant nations and realize that they were prisoners, that the Protestant nations were free, having established their own forms of government, their own constitutions, and elected their own representatives in government, and that they were affluent and wealthy, and they had money, extra money to spend for education and industry and private enterprise, all as a result of the liberty wherewith Christ had made them free, and the Roman Catholics in the Roman Catholic nations wanted the same types of liberties. And so they began to rebel against the papacy. They rebelled against papal tyranny. They found themselves repressed and suppressed and disadvantaged, extremely disadvantaged in comparison to the liberty of the Protestant nations. And so they rebelled against the papacy, hoping to achieve a liberty of electing their own governments and making their own laws. And the papacy, at the same time, in trying to defend his temporal and spiritual power, united with all the kings of Europe, with the assistance of the Jesuits, to suppress these rebellious tendencies in the Roman Catholic nations. And one of the efforts was to make it a dogma of the Roman Catholic Church that Catholics must submit to the blue blood ruling class, those kings over which the Pope ruled, those kings who shared the divine right of kings with the Pope, and that to rebel against these kings was directly a rebellion against the papacy, against the divine right, that which the Pope claims as the vicar and the replacement of the Son of God on earth. Now, he is Antichrist. Okay, Vicar of Christ means Antichrist. And while these Catholics in these Roman Catholic nations erroneously wish to remain Roman Catholic and to acknowledge the spiritual power of the Pope in the Church, they wish to separate the Church and the state and to kind of have it both ways. They wanted to be Roman Catholic. They wanted to worship the Pope and spiritual things, but they wanted him to stay out of civil affairs. And the Pope wouldn't have it. It's my way or the highway. And you know, the Protestants would say it's all or nothing. The Protestants realized that the Pope was the very Antichrist of the Bible. They wouldn't acknowledge either his spiritual power or his temporal power. He was nothing in the world but Antichrist. And they enjoyed liberty. They were enjoying the liberty of Christ. Now, the Catholics, not realizing or not accepting that the Pope was the Antichrist, wished to remain Roman Catholics and to worship the Pope. But they wanted the advantages of Protestantism. And the Pope, together with the Jesuits and the kings of the earth, would not allow this to happen. And we're talking about the period of time in this particular part of the discussion about the papal reign of Pope Gregory the 16th. And we'll back up to the beginning of the paragraph where we left off last time on page 287, the first full paragraph, if you're following along in your own copy of the book. Now, speaking of Pope Gregory the 16th, who wishes to make it a dogma of the Church, a tenet of the Church, that any rebellion against a sovereign potentate, a sovereign king, was in fact a rebellion against the papacy. Okay? Now he says, about this system of faith that he's trying to prop up. In other words, a union of church and state. He says, R.W. Thompson, the author of the book, says, he erects his system of faith upon this premise, that neither the Pope nor the Church can be made subject to the civil authority of any country. That is, that he may disobey all human laws which place any restraint upon his authority as he shall define it at his own pleasure. In other words, the Pope's going to maintain his sovereignty. He, as the replacement of the Son of God on earth, is not subject to the opinion or laws of any nation. Okay, he holds the place of God Almighty on the earth, and men are not to rule over God. Okay, this is the entire tenet of the papacy. This is the entire thesis behind which the papacy hides. He is subject to no authority on the earth. And this is what he tried to reaffirm during this period when his temporal power was being threatened. Now, it's also a precaution by reminding these Roman Catholics that if you should succeed in your rebellion against my divine right authority and establish your own governments in rebellion against my papal kings, we're not going to obey any of your laws. Because I am Jesus Christ on the earth, and my kings are my divine right servants, and we are not bound by any laws of man. Okay? But the same should be said if the rebellion failed. The civil power, if it should ever rebel against the papacy, which in many cases in history it did, even these papal kings rebelled against the Pope, the Pope reaffirms he's not subject to any law. Now, he says, affirming that all who do not assent to the faith as announced by the Pope, quote, will perish eternally without any doubt, unquote, he condemned all other professions of religious faith as the, quote, the most fruitful cause of evil, unquote. In other words, he's denouncing Protestantism because, after all, he recognizes that this rebellion in Italy, in this case, is a direct result of the heresies, as viewed by the papacy, the heresies that came out of the Protestant Reformation, that there are no such thing as divine right of kings. The Pope has no divine right, and neither do the sovereigns, the sovereigns of the Holy Alliance, the kings, the blue bloods. Okay, they have no divine right authority whatsoever. That Christ is the king, and his law is written on their hearts, and they are not subject to the Pope's authority. He says, affirming that all who do not assent to the faith as announced by the Pope, quote, will perish eternally without any doubt, unquote, he condemned all other professions of religious faith as, quote, most fruitful cause of evil, unquote. The diversity of religious professions he considered the, quote, poison source, unquote, of, quote, that false and absurd, or rather extravagant maxim that liberty of conscience should be established and guaranteed to each man, unquote. Okay, according to the papacy, liberty of conscience, liberty of religion, in other words, is abject sinfulness. You may not determine your own religion, not even if it's brought from the Bible. You must obey the papacy as the divine right king of the world, spiritually and temporally. Okay, liberty of conscience is denounced as heresy and rebellion against the papacy. Now, he characterized this liberty of conscience as, quote, a most contagious error, unquote, to which leads that absolute and unbridled liberty of opinion. That's right. In the Roman Catholic Church, you're not allowed to have your own freedom of opinion, which for the ruin of the church and state spreads over the world, and which some men, by unbridled impudence, fear not to represent as advantageous to the church, unquote. That's right. Some of these people who advocated rebellion against the papacy, as the papacy saw it, said that this liberty would be advantageous to the church. In other words, the church wouldn't be, the papacy in particular, the church as a whole, because the Pope is the church, would not any longer be burdened by civil affairs. It would be advantageous to the church. The church could then focus only on spiritual things. And the government of the world could be left to the people and the governments that they elect and the constitutions that they write. But the papacy says, you dare say that this rebellion would be advantageous to the church? Union of church and state is the papal system. Anytime anybody tries to separate the temporal key from the spiritual key, remember the two keys of Peter? One the spiritual, the other the temporal. Anyone who ever attempts to separate those keys, in other words, to relegate the Pope to just a priest and not a king, is a direct violation of the Pope's godlike status in the world. And the papacy is never going to tolerate, never has and never will. But this is what the Roman Catholics of Spain and Portugal and France and now Italy is attempting to do. Now, having thus denounced liberty of conscience as sinful and its advocates as guilty of quote-unquote unbridled impudence, he, as a necessary consequence, blended with it, quote, the liberty of the press. Now, it just follows that if the Pope denies every man liberty of conscience, certainly someone who asserts that liberty certainly is not going to be allowed to write about it in the newspapers or publish books to that effect, right? So the papacy, in conjunction with no freedom of religion, no freedom of conscience, no freedom of speech, includes also no freedom of the press. So when you see any time in the world the liberty of the press being suppressed, you have to automatically suspect that the papacy is involved in this. And everybody in our society, with a brain at least, comprehends that the press is minutely controlled. The press doesn't give us information by which we can make rational decisions in this world. The press has an agenda, and that is to maintain the papal proxy wars that the United States is fighting around the world to conquer the rest of these rebellious religions and nations and to bring them under the divine right authority of the papacy. So liberty of the press is alive and well and dominant in the United States today, just as liberty of conscience is under attack, and liberty of religion, especially after Vatican Council II. Now, again, he says, having thus denounced liberty of conscience as sinful and its advocates as guilty of unbridled impudence, he, as a necessary consequence, blended it with liberty of the press, which he called, quote, the most fatal liberty, an execrable liberty for which there can never be sufficient horror, unquote. Why is the papacy so horrified by liberty of conscience, liberty of speech, liberty of the press? Because if people are free to read Bibles in their own languages and read them according to the leading and teaching of the Holy Spirit, comparing Scripture with Scripture, and using their own judgments rather than the judgments of the priests, and then speaking about it, and then writing about it, we have another Protestant Reformation taking place in the Roman Catholic Church, and liberty reigns, and the Pope is reduced to a doddering old fool in a very richly decorated castle in Rome. He has no servants. He has no one who bows to him and kisses his ring. He's left alone to enjoy Michelangelo's paintings. And he's nothing in the world but Antichrist. The papacy must stop liberty of conscience, liberty of religion, liberty of speech, liberty of the press in order to maintain his temporal and spiritual power in the world. And any time that temporal or spiritual power is challenged in the world, the papacy loses. Anytime the Bible is read and the Holy Spirit is allowed to convict the consciences of man, the papacy is identified as Antichrist. So for the papacy to survive as the Antichrist who tyrannizes over the world, denying people the right that Christ has made us free, then the papacy will do it, even if it requires the use of force, as in the case of the papacy's use of Austria. The military might of Europe, Austria, to suppress this rebellion in Italy. Now, these two great liberties, freedom of press, freedom of speech, universally understood to constitute the basis of popular government. That's right, you can't have a government of, by, and for the people if free speech and free press are not the tenets of it. It says, these two great liberties, universally understood to constitute the basis of popular government, caused him, as he declared, to shudder, because he considered them monstrous doctrines, or rather prodigies of error. He charged the people of Italy, who were demanding a constitution, quote, with the blackest machinations of revolt and sedition, in their endeavor to destroy the fidelity due to princes, that is, the papal kings, and to hurl them from their thrones, unquote. And he was absolutely right. That's what it was all intended to do, to put the papacy and all of his papal kings into the romper room where they belong, so that the people, now possessed of the truth, could govern themselves according to God's holy word. You see why the papacy is so fearful? The papacy is a beggar. If people will not worship the Pope as he desires to be worshipped, of their own volition, the Pope has to use force. Okay, not by persuasion can the Pope maintain his spiritual and temporal power. Not even in Roman Catholic countries. He has to use force. And it says, in the further inculcation of the duty of constant submission to princes, he declared that his submission has its source in the holiest precepts of the Christian religion. Wherefore he insisted that the Vaudois, the Bogards, the Wycliffites, and other like children of Belial, that's right, those Bible-believing Christians who are the forefathers of the Protestant Reformation, the Vaudois, in other words, the Waldenses, the Valley people, the Albigensians, the Beauregard, the Begards, the Wycliffites, and other like children of Belial, says the Pope. They were children of Christ in actuality. But the Pope regards them as children of Belial, the shame and opprobrium of the human race, as they were called by the Pope, were justly anathematized by the Holy See. He said they were justly anathematized by the Holy See. Now that's a whitewash, because they weren't just anathematized. The papacy did all in its power, with the help of the kings over whom he ruled, to annihilate these people. And in the case of the Albigensians, they were annihilated. The Waldenses barely escaped, and the Wycliffites were pursued everywhere they went. Okay? They led to the Protestant Reformation. And the Jesuits and the Inquisition were brought up to suppress the Protestant Reformation and every tenet that followed from the Protestant Reformation. Force. Brute force, bloody brute force, is the papacy's only remedy when the truth finally enlightens the people. When the gospel of Jesus Christ finally seeks to the marrow of their bones, force is the only power left to the papacy to maintain his self-arrogated position in the world. Now, this Pope Gregory XVI condemned the separation of church and state by characterizing it as, quote, the rupture of concord between the priesthood and the empire, unquote, which he desired to preserve. Because, said he, quote, it is an established fact that all the votaries of the most unbridled liberty fear more than all else this concord, which has always been so salutary and so happy for church and state. In other words, all those who enjoy the liberty in Christ fear this concord of church and state, where the priests rule over the kings of the empire, where the supreme priest, the Pope, rules over the kings of the earth. This is Bible fulfillment. Bible prophecy fulfillment right here. That city, that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. It's Vatican City. And he said Gregory XVI claimed infallibility, that is, that he spoke by the inspiration and the authority of God, and therefore could not err, and by virtue thereof commanded absolute obedience to all these doctrines as necessary parts of the Catholic faith. The author, again, erroneously uses the term Christian to describe Roman Catholicism. It is not Christianity, it is anti-Christianity for all the reasons we've given. He considered absolute obedience to these doctrines as absolutely necessary part of the quote-unquote Christian faith under the severest penalties for disobedience. That is death, right? I mean, that's, of course, the ultimate power that the Pope can exert upon those who rebel against the papacy's authority is death by torture, okay, force, coercion. Consequently, when the Roman Catholic populations of the Italian states who had inaugurated the revolution were informed of the doctrines thus announced by the Pope, it was manifest to them, in other words, it was clear to them that his purpose was to condemn as sinful and heretical everything they sought after. They were absolutely correct. And it says, if they had doubted before, they were then forced to realize that if the revolution should be suppressed and the absolute temporal authority of the Pope be continued, the church and the state would remain united. The liberty of conscience, of speech, and of the press would be perpetually denied to them. The laws would have been made by the Pope's dictation and not by their own. The sovereigns of the Holy Alliance and the Jesuits would win a complete and probably a final triumph over liberalism, and that the Italian people would be required by compulsion, if necessary, to assent to and maintain a form of religious faith which inculcated the doctrine that constant submission to princes was commanded by the holiest precepts of the Gospels. It's crunch time for Italy. What do you suppose they're going to do? We'll talk about it when we get back from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
Record budget deficits, bankruptcies galore, and the U.S. dollar is at an all-time low. With today's gloomy economic outlook, safe investments are often hard to find. For over a decade, Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company has been helping people secure their future by investing in the precious metals. Melody has the honesty, integrity, and experience that is often lacking in the precious metals business. Let her put it to work for you. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you approve of Inquisition Update and value the information you're getting here and would like to see it stay on the air, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Now, speaking of these Italian people, these Italians, Roman Catholics, Roman Catholicism is the national religion of Italy. If they had doubted before, they were then forced to realize that if the revolution should be suppressed and the absolute temporal authority of the Pope be continued, the church and the state would remain united. The liberty of conscience, liberty of speech, and liberty of the press would be perpetually denied to them. The laws would be made at the Pope's dictation and not by themselves. The sovereigns of the quote-unquote Holy Alliance, that is the papal kings and the Jesuits, would win a complete and probably a final triumph over liberalism, and that the Italian people would be required by compulsion, if necessary, to assent to and maintain a form of religious faith which inculcated the doctrine that, quote, constant submission to princes, unquote, was commanded by, quote, the holiest precepts, unquote, of the Gospels. In other words, to be a true Christian, or in the truth, a true Catholic, You must submit to the papal kings. You can't overthrow your government. You can't rebel against the government. You can't disagree with the government. You can't speak out against the government. You can't write about negatively about the government. Your conscience must be held captive by the government because the government represents the Pope. And to speak ill or to write ill or to think ill about the government is to do so against the Pope. Any threat against or any rebellion against the kings over which the Pope rules is rebellion against the Pope. Union of church and state, that's how it's described. A perfect, inseparable union of church and state. This is depicted even upon the papal flag. The golden key represents the Pope's spiritual power. The silver key represents his temporal power. They are bound by a scarlet-colored cord. If anyone attempts to separate those two keys, in other words, to separate the church from the state or the state from the church, bloodshed results. And that's the entire history of the papacy. R.W. Thompson is well aware of this, and he knows that for this country to survive, this Protestant nation to survive, where it has a constitution, a Bill of Rights, where the people make the laws, cannot survive unless it recognizes the threat that Roman Catholicism poses to it, that the papacy poses to it, and that the divine right of kings poses to it. And we are to be ever vigilant that none of the tenets of this holy alliance between the papacy and the blue bloods is ever implemented in this country. No attempt to unite church and state should ever be tolerated in this country. To be more specific, no one in this country, whether he be Catholic or Protestant, given the history of the Roman Catholic Church, should ever tolerate a priest dictating to a congressman or a senator or a president or a Supreme Court justice what he shall think, do, or say. No union of church and state. Whenever you see the priests of the Roman Catholic Church having precedence in Washington, D.C., or in any state capital, or even in any local government, you are seeing right before your very eyes an attempt to unite church and state again. The United States put a wall of separation between church and state so that the papacy could never overthrow our government. That's the very purpose for the separation clause in the Constitution. It understood the history of the papacy. Some of the founding fathers demanded and would not sign the Constitution, and it was threatened that it would not be ratified unless a wall of separation was instituted into the Constitution to preserve that Constitution. They knew that the Constitution didn't stand a ghost chance in Hades if there was not within that Constitution a permanent, impenetrable wall of separation between church and state, and preserve the right of the people both to speak and to write against the Pope and the King. We have liberty of speech to preserve our right to criticize both the Pope and the King, the Holy Alliance. And Italy wants to do the same thing, as did France, Spain, and Portugal, all Roman Catholic nations. We don't want the Roman Catholic Church to be the religion of this state. That should be the case of every state in the Union, and it should certainly be the case of every city in this country. Catholics should not be allowed to sit as mayor or in the city council chambers unless they submit to a separation of church and state. But the papacy issues encyclical after encyclical after encyclical demanding that every Roman Catholic in every form of government in this country, local, state, or federal, on pain of excommunication and eternal damnation, must do all in their power, in their vocations as rulers, and as their avocations in their lives, do everything in their power to uphold the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope. And that can only mean one thing, the overthrow of our Constitution. Anytime you see this wall of separation, the separation clause, challenged by anybody in this country, you must know that the Jesuits and the Roman Catholic Church are behind it. And this is the whole purpose for this author writing this book, to warn the American people through examples of history how the papacy behaved any time its temporal or spiritual power was threatened, as it was even in Roman Catholic Italy, Roman Catholic France, Roman Catholic Spain, Roman Catholic Portugal, everywhere in Europe. We're talking about the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism. In Protestantism, there is a separation of church and state. In Catholicism, church and state are united. So any attempt to unite church and state should be viewed by God's people in this country as a method of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuit-led Counter-Reformation. After all, the Jesuits are the ones behind this so-called Holy Alliance that was formed between the Pope and the Blue Bloods of Europe to maintain their dominance and control and oppression in the Roman Catholic countries. And these rebellions in these Roman Catholic countries failed on only one condition. They simply would not abandon the Roman Catholic Church. They wanted 1 foot out and 1 foot in. They wanted to play the hokey pokey. But Christ won't accept them on those terms. He won't protect them on those terms. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve Jesus with your mouth and the Pope with your hands and your feet. It won't work in France. It won't work in Spain. It won't work in Portugal. And it certainly won't work in Italy. And it damn sure won't work in the United States of America. This country was once Protestant. We've known the truth. We've had and enjoyed the liberty of Jesus Christ for nearly since its founding. But we no longer count ourselves worthy of the liberty whereby Christ has made us free, and we've joined the ecumenical movement, the Jesuit-led ecumenical movement, to reunite the Protestants of this country and put them back under the authority of the papacy, who carries the temporal sword through our own government. I mean, how could you find a greater way to insult Christ than to wish to get back into bed with the whore of Rome? Spiritual fornication. That's what Vatican Council II is. That's what the ecumenical movement is. That's what all these non-denominational meetings are all about. I'm Protestant, and I'll protest till God takes my last breath. And if it offends my ecumenical evangeli-belly friends, well, that's just tough. Because the truth is offensive to those who are in rebellion against Jesus Christ and the body of Christ. We've been freed from papal tyranny. We've had our tongues loosed, our consciences loosed, our presses loosed, and they wish to throw us back into tyranny? Not on my watch. I hope I speak for the majority of my listeners. I hope my listeners are finally getting a clue what the ecumenical movement's really all about and how much power it has given the Roman Catholic Church in Washington, D.C. I mean, how must Rome view this ecumenical movement? These Protestants who once had perfect liberty against the papacy now wish to reunite? And now the priests who governed over the Roman Catholic nations of Europe, these same priests in the United States of America now have a political mandate. They don't just represent the card-carrying Catholics anymore. They represent all Christians in this country. You see what the ecumenical movement got us? The popes and the priests now believe they are in the majority. What was that old adage? When Roman Catholicism is in the minority, it's meek as a lamb. When it's at parity, it's as sly as a fox, but when it's in the majority, it roars like a lion. Well, I'm telling you, Roman Catholicism, together with their ecumenical evangeli belly brethren, are about to roar like a lion. And every time Rome gains the upper hand in history, every single time, God's people bleed and die. That's what's going to happen in this country, or history is a liar. That's what's going to happen in this country, or the Bible is a liar. Now, we must repent of this ecumenical movement. There's no choice about it. Or we will bleed and die. The papacy will govern this nation. And I'll tell you what, it was the last spot on terra firma where Protestantism attempted to establish itself. And the papacy sees it as the most lethal threat it has ever faced. Protestantism, the gospel, the Bible, Jesus Christ, the whole thing is the gravest threat the papacy has ever experienced in its entire existence. The United States used to drip with Protestantism. And if they are on the road to defeating Protestantism in this country, you can bet that if they have their way, they will see to it that Protestantism is so thoroughly extirpated and annihilated in this hemisphere that it could never raise its threatening head again. The truth will never threaten the papacy from this hemisphere again. They will use whatever means at their disposal, whatever might at their disposal, whatever sorcery, whatever deception, whatever military force, whatever technological force that they can muster to make sure that Protestantism never can threaten the papacy again from this hemisphere. We're about to see religious persecution, the likes of which the world has never witnessed before. And all because of Vatican Council II. All because we listen to these Pied Pipers from Rome, Chuck Colson. The names used to just roll off my tongue, and I'm getting older, can't remember the names now, but I'm telling you, we have been deceived, and we've been the instruments of our own destruction because of that deception. This is what happens when you mix the holy with the profane, when you try to mix Christ with Antichrist. This is what happens. Real blood's about to flow in this country. And most of the people, unless they are listeners to Inquisition Update, won't realize who it is that's really killing them. They'll never realize it. The papacy will have committed another Holocaust and will not suffer the blame. Rome will get by with it again. I don't want anybody within the sound of my voice to misunderstand what's really happening in this country. R.W. Thompson said the Pope had spoken plainly, and it was impossible not to understand how clearly and sharply he had made the issue between submission and revolution. What were they, under these circumstances, to do? They had already chosen revolution. Should they abandon it for fear of the Austrian bayonets? The import and seriousness of this question are easily comprehended. It involved, if they should bring the revolution to a successful end, a constitutional form of government, or by its abandonment, their own consent to the perpetuity of their civil bondage. It's do or die for Italy. If you want a constitution, if you want liberty, you want to be able to compete with the Protestant nations, you must continue this revolution. You must put away the temporal sword of the Pope and assert your manhood and take over the country, or submit to perpetual bondage to the Pope. It was clear to the Italian people. Why is it not clear to the Protestants of this country? We have Catholics in Italy thinking clearly in this case, and we have ecumenical evangelibellies that couldn't think their way out of a sandbox. He says, independently of the fact they considered a constitution worth struggling for, they had gone so far they could not retreat without abandoning a cause which might never be revived if they should permit the Pope, in return for Austria's help, to tighten the cords already binding them too tightly for longer endurance. Italy's fed up with the Pope's tyranny and bondage. Roman Catholic Italy was fed up with the papal bondage. They wanted to follow the examples of the Protestant reformers. They wanted liberty. They wanted to cast off the bonds of the Pope. Oh, yes, they wanted to continue to go to the Roman Catholic Church, confess their sins to a priest, and worship Mary, and yada, 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 yada. They didn't want Christ. They wanted the Pope, but they wanted him to stay out of their political affairs. Listen, you can't have it both ways. You accept the Pope's spiritual power, you must accept his temporal power. Or the Pope can raise whatever military force in the world to unite those two keys again. Italy's going to fail because they failed to be Protestant. Says several provisional governments had been formed in the revolting states, and although their functions were suspended, they were not abandoned. Italy is desperately trying to hold on to this revolutionary spirit, see? He says, in view, therefore, of the importance of the issue and all the consequences involved, both present and future, they courageously and patriotically determined that the conflict should be continued to the end. Hooray for the Italian people! Revolution to the end. They were not going to negotiate with the papacy or Austria. Can you dig it? He said the revolutionary spirit had been too thoroughly aroused to be suppressed by the Pope with the Austrian armies at his back. He held it in check, nothing more. So the papacy and the Jesuits, the Holy Alliance, and the military might of Austria only temporarily held in check the revolutionary attitude of the Italian people. Roman Catholics, everyone. Look at the fortitude of these Roman Catholics. That's why I've said so many times, if liberty is to ever be restored in this country, it'll be because the Roman Catholics rebelled against the temporal power of the Pope. They'll come to realize that the Pope's in control of Washington, D.C. They would rather remain Catholic, but they are not going to tolerate the Pope and the priest dictating the civil affairs in this, God help me, Roman Catholic country. You got to ask yourself, where's Protestantism in all this? Here's Tom Fress on Inquisition Update intimating that the only hope for this country is that Catholics rebel against the Pope, that it's not going to come from Protestant circles. It's not going to come from the ecumenical evangelibellies. They're all lovey-dovey with the Pope right now. They're more Catholic than the Catholics are. I mean, you can't make up this stuff. What must Christ be thinking? What must the Protestant reformers be thinking? Those whose bodies were burned at the stake to give us liberty. And this generation seeks papal bondage in the name of peace and unity. Well, I'm telling you, there's not going to be any peace. And there will never be unity between God's people and Antichrist. There's a decision that needs to be made by every man, woman, and child in this continent and this United States. Who are you going to serve? Choose you this day who you are going to serve. because you can't have it both ways any longer. Your indecision, your inaction, your ecumenical spirit is about to lead to the worst bloodshed the world has ever seen. And the blood is going to be on your hands, not mine. It says, events now move slowly from necessity, requiring circumspection and cautious management. The provisional governments were kept in abeyance at Bologna, Parma, Modena, and elsewhere to await developments. A period of difficulty and doubt ensued, during which new combinations were formed, all, however, pointing to a constitution as the grand object to be achieved. The circle of revolutionary influences gradually enlarged, almost reaching the muzzles of the Austrian guns. That's right, they were even ready to eat lead to have their revolution. That's how much they hated the temporal power of the Pope. He says the Pope was forced to realize, evidently to his surprise, that the population would not accept the doctrines of his encyclical as part of their religious faith. In other words, the Roman Catholics of Italy would no longer accept the union of church and state as a tenet of the Roman Catholic Church. They would not allow the Pope to maintain the dogma of the church that for the people to remain Catholic, they must do what the princes said. Union of church and state. They wouldn't tolerate it. They were ready to eat lead to protect themselves from the union of church and state. Protestants won't lift the finger in this country. They're afraid their boat will be rocked. Their Social Security their Social Security check might not show up in the mail if they rebel against this papal government. We've been bought. We've fallen into the trap. No wonder Daniel refused to eat from King Nebuchadnezzar's table. Daniel wished to remain free. We loathe freedom in this country, and now we're going to pay the price. Tomorrow on Inquisition Update.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.